Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts calls Pam Bondi unqualified, and she trashes him on the spot. The room was a pressure cooker, the kind of place where history wasn't just made, it was carved into the walls with every heated word. It was April 28, 2025, and the Supreme Court's private conference chamber, a sanctum of polished mahogany, and muted gold accents crackled with an electric tension that made the air feel alive. Chief Justice John Roberts sat at the head of the long, gleaming table, his dark eyes locked on Pam Bondi, the former Florida Attorney General and a lightning rod of controversy. Her nomination to a prestigious judicial advisory role had sparked whispers for weeks, but no one expected the storm about to erupt. Around them, a dozen justices, clerks, and advisors sat rigid, their breaths shallow as if bracing for a collision. Robert's voice cut through the silence, steady but sharp, like a blade slicing velvet. Ms. Bondi, your qualifications for this role are, in my professional opinion, inadequate. Your experience leans heavily on political theater, not the nuanced, impartial judgment required here. I cannot support your nomination. The words landed like a thunderclap. Pam Bondi, her face usually a mask of prosecutorial calm, flushed a deep red, her hazel eyes blazing with a fury that seemed to radiate heat. For a moment, the room held its breath, waiting for her to nod, to retreat, to play the diplomat. But Bondi wasn't built for retreat. She rose from her chair, her navy suit crisp against the muted backdrop, and planted her hands on the table, leaning toward Roberts with a defiance that made the chandelier above seem to flicker. "Unqualified?" she said, her voice low but trembling with raw emotion. "You sit there, Chief Justice, in your ivory tower, and you have the audacity to call me unqualified? I've spent decades in courtrooms, fighting for victims, locking up criminals, and standing up to power. You think your fancy robes and your elite degrees make you better suited to understand justice? I've lived it while you've been writing. Opinions from the safety of this palace." The room gasped, a collective intake of air that seemed to suck the oxygen out. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, seated to Robert's left, raised an eyebrow, her lips parting slightly, but she stayed silent. A young clerk, barely 30, muttered under his breath, "This is insane," earning a sharp glance from an older advisor. Roberts, though, didn't flinch. His face was a study in control, his fingers steepled as he met Bondi's gaze. "This isn't about your prosecutorial record, Miss Bondi," he said, his tone measured but firm. "It's about your ability to provide objective and constitutionally sound advice. Your public statements, your attacks on the judiciary, your alignment with polarizing figures cast serious doubt on your impartiality." Bondi's laugh was sharp, almost a bark, echoing off the high ceilings. "Impartiality. Don't lecture me about impartiality, Your Honor. You and your colleagues play the same game, cloaked in tradition and precedent. You think I don't see the politics in your rulings? The careful dance you do to keep the powerful happy? I'm not here to play nice with the establishment. I'm here to shake it up." The room erupted into murmurs, advisors whispering furiously, pens scratching as clerks jotted notes. This wasn't just a disagreement, it was a public unraveling, a clash of titans in a space meant for quiet deliberation. Bondi's voice rose, cutting through the chaos. "I've fought for every inch of my career. I've faced death threats, smear campaigns, and rooms full of men who thought I didn't belong. And now you, Chief Justice, think you can dismiss me with a single word. You don't get to define my worth." Then came the unexpected. Bondi's voice cracked and her eyes glistened, not with anger, but with something deeper, more personal. She straightened, her hands trembling as she gripped the table's edge. "You want to know why I'm here?" she said, her voice dropping to a raw whisper. "My mother, Maria, worked 3 jobs to put me through law school. She died last year, and her last words to me were, 'Pam, don't let them break you.' You call me unqualified? You're not just insulting me. You're insulting her memory." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling like a fog. Roberts, for the first time, looked unsettled, his fingers pausing on the gavel he hadn't yet touched. He opened, his mouth perhaps to respond, but Bondi wasn't finished. She grabbed her briefcase, her movements sharp and deliberate, and strode toward the door. "Keep your advisory role," she said, turning back one last time, her voice steady now, resolute. "But this isn't the end. I'll fight for justice my way, with or without your approval." The door slammed behind her, the sound reverberating, like a gunshot. Roberts exhaled, his face unreadable as the room dissolved into hushed chaos. No one knew what would come next, but one thing was clear. Pam Bondi had just set fire to a bridge, and the flames would spread far beyond these walls. The aftermath was immediate. In the marble corridors outside, Bondi stormed past stunned aides, her heels clicking like a metronome of rage. She didn't stop until she reached the Supreme Court's east entrance, where a small crowd of reporters had gathered, tipped off by a leak about the contentious meeting. Cameras flashed as she emerged, into the spring sunlight, her face a mix of defiance and exhaustion. She hadn't planned to speak, but the microphones thrust toward her left, no choice. "Chief Justice Roberts called me unqualified," she said, her voice steady but laced with venom. "Let me be clear. I've spent my life fighting for justice, for the people who don't have a voice. If that makes me unqualified in his eyes, then maybe it's his vision that's the problem, not my record." The reporters erupted, shouting questions, but Bondi waved them off and slid into a waiting black SUV. Inside, she leaned back, closing her eyes as the vehicle pulled away. Her phone buzzed relentlessly. Texts from allies, calls from political operatives, and a flood of notifications as her statement went viral. She ignored them all, her mind replaying the confrontation, her mother's words echoing like a mantra. "Don't let them break you." Back in the conference room, Roberts faced a different kind of chaos. The advisors were divided, some arguing that Bondi's outburst proved her unsuitability, others whispering that Roberts had mishandled the situation, escalating a disagreement into a public spectacle. Sotomayor, ever the pragmatist, spoke up. "John, we need to address this carefully. She's not going away, and neither is the attention she's drawing." Roberts nodded, his expression grim. "I underestimated her reaction," he admitted, a rare concession. "But my stance remains. This role requires restraint, not theatrics. We'll draft a statement clarifying our position, neutral, professional, focused on qualifications." The statement, released an hour later, was textbook. Roberts. Measured, impersonal, reaffirming the Judicial Conference's commitment to excellence and impartiality. But it did little to quell the firestorm. On social media, Bondi's supporters rallied, painting her as a fearless outsider taking on a stuffy elite. Hashtags like "Bondi Fights Back" trended, while critics called her outburst unprofessional. Proof of Roberts' point. Cable news networks looped her exit from the Supreme Court, pundits dissecting every word, every gesture. For Bondi, the day was far from over. She returned to her Washington, D.C. apartment, a modest two-bedroom she'd rented during her nomination process. Dropping her briefcase, she sank onto the couch, the adrenaline finally fading. Her phone lit up with a text from her younger sister, Lisa. "You were amazing, Pam. Mom would be so proud." Bondi smiled, but the weight of the day pressed down. She wasn't naive. She knew her outburst had consequences, potentially derailing her nomination and alienating powerful allies. But she also knew she couldn't have stayed silent. Not after Robert's words, not after everything she'd fought for. She poured a glass of water, avoiding the wine she craved, and turned on the TV. Her face was everywhere. Her words replayed, in endless cycles. She muted the sound, staring at the screen as memories flooded back. Her mother's tired smile after a double shift, the late-night study sessions in law school, the first time she won a case as a prosecutor. Each step had been a battle, and today was no different. But this battle felt bigger, more personal, as if the entire system was daring her to back down. Meanwhile, Roberts faced his own reckoning. In his office, a sanctuary of leather-bound books and framed portraits, he sat alone, the day's events replaying in his mind. He prided himself on his restraint, his ability to navigate the judiciary's complexities without succumbing to emotion. But Bondi had shaken him, not just with her words, but with the raw pain behind them. He thought of his own mother, a schoolteacher who'd instilled in him a love of learning. Bondi's mention of her mother had struck a chord, a reminder that, even in this rarefied world, personal histories shaped every fight. He picked up the phone, dialing a trusted confidant, Judge Margaret McKeown, a circuit court veteran known for her candor. "Maggie, I need your perspective," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Did I misstep with Bondi?" McKeown didn't sugarcoat it. "You were right to question her qualifications, John, but calling her out so publicly? That was blood. In the water. She's not just a lawyer, she's a fighter, and you gave her a stage. Now you've got to deal with the fallout." Robert sighed, rubbing his temples. "I didn't expect her to react like that. The mother comment, it threw me." "That's what makes her dangerous," McKeown said. "She's not just playing to the room. She's playing to the heart. You need to tread carefully, or this will haunt you." As night fell, Washington buzzed with the story. Bars and coffee shops hummed with debates. Some saw Bondi as a hero, others as a loose cannon. In a Georgetown pub, a group of law students argued over beers, one insisting, "She's got guts, but she's no judge," while another countered, "Roberts is out of touch. She's what the system needs." The city, always hungry for drama, devoured the clash, unaware of the deeper currents at play. For Bondi, the real battle was just beginning. She spent the evening on the phone, rallying supporters, strategizing, with her team. Her chief advisor, a sharp-witted operative named Carla Diaz, was blunt. "Pam, you've got momentum, but it's a double-edged sword. The base loves you, but the moderates are spooked. We need to channel this into something constructive, or it's just noise." Bondi nodded, pacing her living room. "I'm not apologizing, Carla. Not for speaking the truth. But I'm not done fighting either. What's our next move?" Carla leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "You go public. Op-eds, interviews, town halls. Tell your story, not just today's fight, but your whole journey. Make it personal. Roberts wants to paint you as unqualified. Show the world you're undeniable." Bondi felt a spark of hope, the same fire that had carried her through countless trials. "Let's do it," she said. "But I'm not just fighting for me. This is for every woman, every outsider who's been told they don't belong." Across town, Roberts prepared for his own next steps. He met with his communications team, crafting a plan to restore calm without ceding ground. "We focus on the process," he told them. "No personal attacks, no engagement with her narrative. We're above the fray." But even as he spoke, he knew it wouldn't be that simple. Bondi wasn't just a nominee, she was a symbol, a lightning rod for a divided nation. Her story, her pain, her defiance resonated with millions who felt ignored by the system. And Roberts, for all his authority, couldn't control the narrative she was weaving. The next morning, Bondi woke to a flood of emails, support from grassroots activists, invitations to speak, even a message from a retired judge who wrote, "You reminded me why I got into law. Keep fighting." She dressed carefully, choosing a bold red blazer, a signal she wasn't backing down. Her first stop was a local radio show, where she spoke with a warmth and candor that disarmed even the skeptical host. "I'm not perfect," she said, her voice steady, "but I've spent my life fighting for what's right, not what's easy. Chief Justice Roberts thinks I don't belong? That's fine. I've heard that before, and I'm still here." The interview went viral, shared across platforms, fueling a groundswell of support. By noon, a petition demanding her nomination be reconsidered had 50,000 signatures. Bondi's team capitalized on the momentum, scheduling appearances across the country, each one a chance to tell her story. Not just the clash with Roberts, but the journey of a woman who'd clawed her way up from nothing. Roberts, meanwhile, faced mounting pressure. Colleagues urged him to soften his stance, warning that the public saw him as elitist, out of touch. He resisted, believing his duty was to the institution, not public opinion. But late that night, alone in his study, he watched Bondi's latest interview, her words about her mother hitting harder than he expected. For the first time, he wondered if he'd misjudged her, not her qualifications, but her resolve. The clash in the chambers had been a spark, but it was igniting something bigger, a national reckoning about who belonged in the halls of power. Bondi, with her raw emotion and unyielding spirit, was no longer just a nominee. She was a movement, one that would challenge Roberts, the judiciary, and the country itself. And as the sun rose over Washington, one truth was undeniable. This story was far from over. The heavy oak doors of the Supreme Court's private conference room slammed shut, sealing the room in a cocoon of tension so thick it felt like the air itself might crack. It was April 28, 2025, and the Judicial Conference, typically a staid affair of legal minds discussing procedure and precedent, had erupted into a battlefield. Chief Justice John Roberts, his face carved from granite, sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, his dark eyes locked on Pam Bondi, the former Florida Attorney General and a polarizing figure now vying for a prestigious judicial advisory role. The room, lined with portraits of past justices staring down like silent judges, buzzed with the electricity of an impending storm. Around the table, a dozen advisors, clerks, and justices sat rigid, their pens frozen mid-note, sensing the clash that was about to unfold. Robert's voice cut through the silence, sharp and deliberate, each word landing like a gavel. Ms. Bondi, your nomination has been reviewed extensively, and I must be candid. Your qualifications for this role are, in my view, wholly inadequate. Your legal experience lacks the depth required, and your public persona, marked by partisan rhetoric, raises serious concerns about your suitability for a position demanding impartiality. The room inhaled as one. Pam Bondi, her tailored navy suit impeccable, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight chignon, froze. Her hazel eyes, usually sharp with the confidence of a seasoned prosecutor, widened for a fraction of a second. Then, like a match struck in a gas-filled room, her expression ignited. She rose from her chair, her movements slow but deliberate, her hands pressing against the table as she leaned forward, her voice low but trembling with barely contained rage. "Unqualified," she said, the word dripping with venom. "You sit there, Chief Justice, in your ivory tower, draped in your robes and your decades of privilege, and you have the audacity to call me unqualified? I've spent 20 years in the trenches, locking up murderers, fighting for victims, standing up for people who don't have a voice. You think your fancy degrees and your marble halls make you more qualified to understand what justice really means?" The room was a powder keg, and Bondi had just lit the fuse. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, seated to Robert's left, shifted in her chair, her lips parting as if to intervene. But she held back, her eyes darting between the two combatants. A young clerk, barely 30, his tie slightly askew, muttered under his breath, "This is insane," earning a sharp glance from an older advisor. Roberts, unflinching, leaned back slightly, his fingers steepled, his voice calm but laced with steel. "This isn't about your prosecutorial record, Ms. Bondi," he said. "It's about your ability to provide objective, constitutionally sound advice. Your public statements, your attacks on judicial independence, your alignment with divisive political figures, cast significant doubt on your capacity to serve in this role without bias." Bondi's laugh was a jagged shard of sound cutting through the room. "Oh, please, spare me the sanctimonious lecture. You talk about judicial independence like it's some untouchable ideal, but let's not kid ourselves. You've got your own agendas, your own cozy connections with the elite. Don't pretend you're above the fray just because you wield a gavel. Gasps rippled around the table. A senior advisor, a gray-haired woman with a reputation for diplomacy, coughed loudly, trying to derail the escalating war of words, but it was no use. Bondi was a force of nature now, her voice rising, her hands gesturing wildly as she turned her fire on the entire room. You all sit here, judging me, acting like I'm some outsider who doesn't belong, but I've fought for every inch of my career. I faced down threats, worked impossible hours, and stood up to power when it would have been easier to back down. And you dare question my commitment to justice? Then came the unexpected. Bondi's voice cracked and her eyes glistened with tears she refused to let fall. She straightened, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table, her voice dropping to a raw, vulnerable whisper. You want to know why I'm here? My mother, God rest her soul, worked 3 jobs to put me through law school. She died last year, and her last words to me were to keep fighting, to never let the system break me. You call me unqualified, Chief Justice. You're not just insulting me. You're insulting her memory. The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking into every corner. Roberts, for the first time, looked unsettled, his fingers pausing on the gavel he hadn't yet used. His lips parted as if to respond. But Bondi wasn't finished. She grabbed her briefcase, her movements sharp and decisive, and strode toward the door. You can keep your precious advisory role, she said, turning back one last time, her voice steady now, laced with defiance. But don't think this is the end. I'll fight for justice my way, with or without your approval. The door slammed behind her, the sound echoing like thunder. For a moment, no one moved. Then the room erupted into hushed whispers, advisors leaning toward each other, clerks scribbling furiously. Roberts sat back, his face unreadable, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. No one knew what would come next, but one thing was clear. Pam Bondi had just set fire to a bridge, and the flames were spreading fast. The aftermath was chaos, though contained within the hallowed walls of the Supreme Court. Outside the conference room, Bondi stormed down the marble hallway, her heels clicking against the polished floor, her breath coming in sharp bursts. She didn't stop until she reached the small office assigned to her for the day, a temporary space with a desk, a chair, and a window overlooking the Capitol. She sank into the chair, her hands shaking as she set her briefcase down. The tears she'd held back in the room now spilled over, hot and angry, streaking her carefully applied makeup. She wasn't crying for Robert's words or the humiliation of the moment. She was crying for her mother, for the years of sacrifice, for the gnawing fear that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't enough. But the tears didn't last long. Bondi wiped her face, her jaw setting as she pulled out her phone. She wasn't done fighting, not by a long shot. Back in the conference room, the mood was a mix of shock and indignation. Justice Neil Gorsuch, typically reserved, spoke first, his voice measured but firm. That was unprecedented. But John, was it necessary to call her out so publicly? She's not wrong about her experience, even if her style is unorthodox. Robert sighed, rubbing his temple. Neil, I didn't intend to ignite a firestorm. But we can't lower the bar for this role. It's too critical. Her record, her public persona, doesn't inspire confidence in her ability to be impartial. Sotomayor, her voice gentle but pointed, chimed in. I get that, John. But you didn't just question her qualifications. You questioned her legitimacy. That's personal. And now we've got a PR nightmare on our hands. She's not going to stay quiet. She was right. By the time the meeting adjourned, Bondi was already crafting a response. Not through a press release or a carefully worded statement, but through a raw, emotional post on X, the platform where she'd built a loyal following. She typed furiously, her fingers flying over the screen. Today, Chief Justice John Roberts called me unqualified in front of a room full of elites. He didn't just attack my record, he attacked my life's work, my mother's sacrifices, and every American who believes justice isn't just for the privileged. I've fought for victims, for fairness, for truth. I won't stop now. Justice for all. The post went viral within minutes, racking up thousands of likes, retweets, and comments. Supporters flooded her feed with messages of encouragement. "You tell him, Pam. Roberts is out of touch." But there were critics, too, accusing her of grandstanding, of turning a professional rejection into a public spectacle. The divide was stark, and it only fueled the fire. By evening, news outlets were picking up the story. CNN ran a segment titled Bondi versus Roberts, a Supreme Showdown, while Fox News framed it as Chief Justice Elitism Exposed. Pundits dissected every word, every gesture, turning the clash into a cultural flashpoint. Was Roberts right to call out Bondi's lack of judicial experience? Or was Bondi justified in fighting back against what she saw as an unfair attack? In her hotel room that night, Bondi sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through the coverage. Her phone buzzed incessantly. Texts from allies, calls from reporters, voicemails from her team urging her to stay calm and plan the next move. But Bondi wasn't in the mood for calm. She felt raw, exposed, and more determined than ever. She opened her laptop and began drafting an op-ed, her words pouring out like a torrent. I've never been one to back down from a fight. Not when I was prosecuting violent criminals, not when I was standing up for Florida's families, and not now, when the Chief Justice of the United States has tried to dismiss my life's work with a single word: unqualified. Let me tell you what qualifies me. It's not just my law degree or my years in the courtroom. It's the lessons I learned from my mother, who worked herself to the bone so I could have a chance. It's the victims I fought for, the communities I served, the battles I won against odds stacked higher than the Supreme Court itself. She wrote late into the night, her words a blend of defiance and vulnerability, a call to arms for anyone who'd ever felt dismissed by the system. By the time she hit send to a major newspaper, it was nearly 3 a.m. She didn't know if they'd publish it, but she felt lighter, as if she'd reclaimed a piece of herself. Meanwhile, across town, Roberts sat in his study, the glow of his computer screen illuminating his tired face. He'd spent the evening fielding calls from colleagues, advisors, and even a few reporters who'd managed to get his private number. The consensus was clear. He'd underestimated Bondi's fire, and now the court was caught in a media maelstrom. His wife, Jane, poked her head into the room, her expression soft but concerned. "John, you need to sleep," she said. "This will blow over." He shook his head, his voice quiet. "I don't know, Jane. I thought I was doing the right thing, protecting the integrity of the process. But maybe I misjudged her. Maybe I misjudged the moment." Jane sat beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You did what you thought was right. But she's not just a lawyer or a politician. She's a fighter. And fighters don't go quietly." Roberts nodded, staring at the screen, where Bondi's ex-post stared back at him, its likes climbing into the tens of thousands. He'd spent his career navigating the delicate balance of law and public perception, but this felt different. This felt personal. The next morning, Washington, D.C. was abuzz with the fallout. Bondi's op-ed had been picked up by the Washington Post, its headline bold and unapologetic. Pam Bondi, Why I Won't Let the Chief Justice Silence Me. The piece was a sensation, shared across social media, debated on morning shows, and dissected by legal scholars. Some praised her raw honesty, others called it a publicity stunt. But no one could deny its impact. Bondi, meanwhile, was back in action, meeting with her team in a sleek downtown office. Her chief strategist, a wiry man named Tom, paced the room, his phone glued to his ear. "Pam, we've got interview requests. From every major outlet, you name it, NBC, MSNBC, even CNN wants you for a prime time slot. This is your moment." Bondi, sipping a coffee, shook her head. "I'm not doing the talking head circuit, Tom. I said what I needed to say in the op-ed. Now I want to focus on the work. Real work, for real people." Tom stopped pacing, his eyes wide. "Pam, you're trending #1 on X. You've got a platform bigger than ever. You can't just walk away from that." "I'm not walking away," she said, her voice firm. "But I'm not going to let this turn into a reality show. I'm going to keep fighting for justice, like I always have. That's what my mother would want." The room fell quiet, her team exchanging glances. They knew better than to argue when Bondi got that look in her eye, the look of a woman who'd faced down worse than a Supreme Court rebuke and come out swinging. Back at the Supreme Court, Roberts convened an emergency meeting with his senior advisors. The agenda was simple: damage control. The media frenzy was threatening to overshadow the court's work, and whispers of internal dissent were starting to leak. One advisor, a seasoned PR expert, suggested a public statement clarifying Roberts' position without escalating the feud. "No," Roberts said, his voice resolute. "I won't add fuel to the fire. We'll let the process speak for itself. The nomination will move forward with another candidate, and we'll focus on our docket." But it wasn't that simple. Bondi's outburst had struck a chord, tapping into a broader frustration with the perceived elitism of institutions like the Supreme Court. Protests, small but vocal, sprang up outside the court with signs reading "Justice for Pam" and "Elites don't get it." The narrative was slipping out of Roberts' control, and he knew it. Days turned into weeks, and the clash between Bondi and Roberts became a cultural touchstone. Bondi threw herself into her work, launching a series of high-profile cases, advocating for victims' rights, each move calculated to show she didn't need the court's approval to make a difference. Her supporters rallied around her, calling her a warrior for the people, while her critics accused her of exploiting the drama for clout. Roberts, meanwhile, faced his own challenges. The court's approval ratings, already shaky, took a hit, with polls showing a growing distrust among Americans who saw the institution as out of touch. He worked tirelessly behind the scenes, meeting with justices, advisors, and even community leaders to rebuild trust, but the shadow of the Bondi clash lingered. One evening, as Bondi prepared for a speech at a victims' rights gala, she received an unexpected package. Inside was a handwritten note, unsigned but unmistakably from someone within the court's orbit. It read, "You were heard. Keep fighting, but choose your battles wisely." Bondi stared at the note, her mind racing. Was it a warning? An olive branch? She didn't know, but it didn't matter. She tucked it into her purse and stepped onto the stage, her voice strong and clear as she addressed the crowd. "Justice isn't handed to you," she said, her eyes shining with resolve. "You have to fight for it. Every day, every moment, no matter who stands in your way." Across town, Roberts watched the speech on his television, his expression unreadable. Jane sat beside him, her hand resting on his. "She's not going away, is she?" Jane asked. "No," Roberts said quietly. "And maybe that's not such a bad thing." The clash in the chambers had changed them both, exposing raw truths and igniting a fire that wouldn't be easily extinguished. For Bondi, it was a call to keep fighting, to honor her mother's legacy and her own relentless spirit. For Roberts, it was a reminder that justice, like the people it served, was messy, human, and fiercely contested. And in the heart of Washington, the battle for what justice meant and who got to define it raged on.